Hi there, welcome back to a lecture on language and ontology in ancient and early analytic philosophy. Today I want to talk about Alexius Meinong, and the title of the lecture is Aristotle in Meinong's Jungle. I'll be talking in particular about basically it's an introduction that Meinong gave to a collection of papers, and the name of the introduction is Über Gegenstandstheorie. Came from this volume, Untersuchungen zur Gegenstandstheorie in Psychologie. It's basically a collection of papers that were produced by many of Meinong's students in his psychology lab in Graz. I'll tell you a little bit about Meinong, and then I'm going to transition to the ancient text for today, which is De Interpretatione, Aristotle's De Interpretatione, chapters 1 to 8. I'm going to save the very difficult 9th chapter on future contingents for the next time. So first, a little bit about Alexius Meinong. He was born in 1853 and was a student of Franz Brentano while the latter was still professor in Vienna. He's known for his theory of objects, which itself is probably best known under the pejorative title it was given by William Neal in Neal's 1949 Probability and Induction. There, Neal refers to the status of propositions and claims that it is not tenable anymore to hold propositions to be ultimate entities, and he supports this claim basically with a slur. He says, "But after a period of wandering in Meinong's jungle of subsistence, philosophers are now agreed that propositions cannot be regarded as ultimate entities, independent alike of facts, sentences, and acts of thinking." End quote. That's on page 12 of Neal's Probability and Induction. Now, this jungle is meant to characterize negatively, obviously, the various entities which Meinong postulated as the objects of intentional states. Neal's characterization of Meinong is not very informative, but it is rather glib. It manages to obscure Meinong's considerable influence on Russell and early analytic philosophy, even after Russell's break with Meinong in the essay on denoting. In fact, many central notions of early analytic philosophy can only really be understood with regard to Meinong's theories, which were developed with a rare carefulness and circumspection. One of my points today is that Meinong is much better than the reputation of his jungle. Now, his essay on the theory of objects, Über Gegenstandstheorie, which was published in 1904, was written as the introduction to a collection of studies, as I said, by his students from the University of Graz, where Meinong enjoyed a productive career from his appointment in 1882 until his retirement in 1920. Following the model of Wilhelm Wundt, Meinong set up a lab for experimental psychology in Graz, and several of the papers in this collection present results from research in that lab. Meinong is careful, however, in his introduction to avoid the impression of reducing the study of objects to questions of empirical psychology, a tendency which had just been criticized trenchantly by another student of Brentano, namely Edmund Husserl, in his Prolegomena to the Logische Untersuchungen, which appeared a couple of years before this collection of essays. So the tricky task which Meinong is trying to undertake in his essay is to position the theory of objects as neither a psychological, logical, nor metaphysical theory. So he's basically trying to carve out space for the theory of objects vis-a-vis all of these different existing enterprises. He begins by setting out a claim which was common to all students of Brentano: the mark of the mental is intentionality. Meinong puts it this way in the very first paragraph of his 50-page introduction: that one cannot know without knowing something is one of the most obvious things, he says on page 1. He goes on to argue that any and every mental state, including hoping, fearing, judging, assuming, supposing, etc., is so structured as to have some object. This was basically just plain common doctrine and common sense, certainly since Brentano's psychology from an empirical point of view. The question he seeks to answer in the essay is, what science is responsible for the study of all objects of our mental states? It's the opening for his construction of the science of objects. Now, the paradigmatic mental act for this science is the act of knowing, erkennen. For, as Meinong argues, the objects of knowledge include all objects to which one can be intentionally directed. So his argument here will be that the study of objects will study first and foremost the objects of knowledge, because the objects of knowledge build the class of all classes of mentally directed states. First, Meinong confronts an objection that comes from a kind of theory of science point of view. Why should we have a study of the objects of knowledge, i.e. a study of objects which are known, when they're already known by existing departmental disciplines? At this point, Meinong seeks to diffuse this objection by pointing out that there is such a science of the known, which exists, as it were, next to the individual departmental disciplines. That's metaphysics. But he's also loath to identify the science of objects with metaphysics. He's actually going to seek to find a place for the study of objects that will occupy a part of what is traditionally thought of as metaphysics. But first he has to put metaphysics in its proper place, and in this part of his essay he engages in what is more recently called metametaphysics by saying what metaphysics is and what kind of things it can, what kind of questions it can handle. He assigns metaphysics the realm of everything which exists. And then he shows, with continual reference to the science of mathematics, that the existent is just a very small part of the objects of science. Now, it's this point that the reader is introduced to Meinong's famous jungle. Of course, he doesn't call it that. He never described his theory in those terms. Around page 5 of the introduction, he invokes the distinction between ideal, i.e. non-existent objects such as mathematical objects, but also relations, identity, non-identity, and real objects. And he distinguishes further between the objects which are featured in the contents of propositions expressing knowledge and the propositional content of what is known itself. What is expressed in context is what Meinong calls an objektiv, and which other philosophers around the same time would call a Sachverhalt, which enters analytic philosophy as the term state of affairs. As Meinong points out, states of affairs either obtain, bestehen, or they do not obtain, sie bestehen nicht. They have no existence of their own. Now, we can see here that the idea of non-existent objects, such as mathematical objects, and states of affairs that feature them, is not quite so exotic as the jungle metaphor suggests. At least it remained a straightforward idea for all of those who, following Frege, refused to reduce mathematical objects to mere properties. But it still requires a little bit of elaboration. Now, in a further subchapter entitled On Being So and Being, So sein und sein, Meinong further explores the implications of non-existent, that is, subsisting, objects of knowledge in this case. Both the being and the being so, the sein and the so sein, of an object may feature in states of affairs, but the state of affairs of an object's being must be distinguished from the state of affair of an object's being so. This is such an important difference that Meinong formulates it in terms of a principle. The being so of an object is independent of its being. It's on page 8 of his essay. Now, Meinong is seeking here room for a point which will be familiar to readers of Plato's Sophist. If we wish to negate the being of a certain item, we must first call up the item in order to feature it in a judgment of the form, item X does not exist. And so the state of affairs featuring the non-existence of such an item will be the case, bestehen. The object featured in this objektiv, or state of affairs, will have to be in some way, even if the state of affairs is one in which the item or object is said not to exist, or to have no being. So in this way, the being so is independent of the object's being. The being of an object can also be subject to differentiation. Meinong distinguishes between existence of obtaining, whereby existence is a mode of being for objects, and obtaining is the type of being applicable to states of affairs. Now, the being of a state of affairs is not at all dependent on the being of an object featured in it, for there can be true states of affairs about non-existent objects. These are mathematical truths on Meinong's view. The being or non-being of an object is not something that has any source in the object per se, but which is expressed in the state of affairs concerning the object. And this is, as it were, an answer to the puzzle of the sophist of how you can talk about what is not. We can understand Meinong's point in this case as parallel to a point that Frege makes about the difference between propositions and assertions. So the proposition 5 plus 7 equals 12 can be given in different ways. For example, I can report that my dog Annabelle doubts that 5 plus 7 is equal to 12. Actually, I don't think she has access to such a doubt, but that's just an example. Or I can assert that everyone knows that 5 plus 7 equals 12. The string of symbols 5 plus 7 equals 12 is not in itself an assertion, though, of course, in most contexts, if we say something that seems self-evident, people will take it as an assertion, but that's a pragmatic question. Now, in paragraph 5, Meinong comes to the task of distinguishing between the manner in which the objects of knowledge are studied by psychology and that the manner in which they're studied by his science of objects, which he's basically trying to found in this volume. He begins by pointing out that the science of objects has been properly distinguished from metaphysics as the general theory of the real, that's what metaphysics does, but that psychology remains to be considered because it is not concerned exclusively with what is real, and it is concerned with all objects of cognition, including perception, emotional dispositions, and also knowing. Now, here Meinong resorts to analogies, a sign that things are getting difficult. For example, he draws an analogy between classics in a broad sense, Altertumskunde, and classical philology, klassische Philologie, in order to argue that the relationship between psychology and the theory of objects is in some way partially overlapping. The crucial distinction comes later when Meinong states that psychology is only interested in objects from their subjective side. That's on page 18. He concludes this chapter with the claim that the class of the objects of knowledge includes the classes of every type of intentional state. It is the class of all classes of mentally directed phenomena or mental objects. So the relationship between the theory of objects and pure logic remains to be considered. That's considered in part 7. And it's of some importance also for our transition to Aristotle's De Interpretatione, because here Meinong begins by situating the study of objects not just to logic, but also to grammar, two things that seem to overlap also in Aristotle's De Interpretatione. He begins by pledging allegiance to Husserl's critique of psychologism in relation to logical matters, but then questions whether logical concepts such as sentence and representation, Satz und Vorstellung, can ever be fully cleansed of their psychological connotations. Meinong actually counters here with a proposal that we distinguish the propositional content expressing the state of affairs of a given object as the objective side of knowing. Remember, he calls what other philosophers dub Sachverhalt, or state of affairs, an objective, and wants to express, I think, with that we are dealing with the objective side, as it were, of mental content, or propositional content. And generally, so he wants to distinguish between that and the subjective side of cognition, which would, as it were, be the psychological part of knowing. And on his account, psychologism is just a failure to make this very distinction between, as it were, the subjective access or propositional attitude and the propositional content. Now, when we turn to Aristotle's De Interpretatione, we're easily tempted to assume that we've come to a much simpler and less jungle-like place. The first thing we encounter is what we have come to think of as basic grammar. I cite the first line of De Interpretatione. First, we must establish what a name is and what a verb is, and then what is negation, affirmation, statement, and sentence. That's logos. So that's the first chapter of De Interpretatione, 16a, 1-2. The next paragraph of the first chapter immediately introduces, however, the context of language as mental representation. He writes, spoken sounds are symbols of affections in the soul, and written marks are symbols of spoken sounds. Languages differ among peoples, but the affections of the soul are the same for all. They are the likenesses of our common ontological heritage, things as they are in the world. We are given a reference to De Anima for further particulars, and this could be a reference to De Anima, Book 3, chapters 3-8, where Aristotle's theory of thinking is developed, but there's also a relevant passage in De Anima, Book 2, chapter 5, where Aristotle states that the perceptive faculty is potentially like the object of perception already is in actuality. That's at 418a 3-6. This is the restatement of a thesis developed in the course of De Anima Book 2, Chapter 5, that perception is of particulars and knowledge is of universals, and that one can think at will but not perceive at will because universals are somehow in the soul itself, as he says at 417b, 21-23. Now, in any case, the implication at the beginning of the De Interpretatione is that the elements of a language are linguistic symbols of universal mental representations of things. Spoken words are symbols of affections in the soul, and these affections are themselves representations of things in the world. Now, Aristotle then introduces what would seem to resemble what we call propositional content, but he calls it thought, noema. He writes that just as a noema can sometimes occur in the soul without being true or false, and can sometimes necessarily be either true or false, so too in speech, and he determines the context of truth-functional speech as that of connection and division. As Aristotle will point out later, not every well-formed utterance in a language is capable of being true or false. Only statement sentences are. Prayers, for example, don't have a truth value. Wishes wouldn't either. Single names and verbs without connection are also examples of noemata, thoughts, that cannot be true or false. Today we'd probably rather call them concepts. In a Meinongian spirit, we could think of them as objects. At least one example of an unconnected thought would suggest a kind of Meinongian object, and that is the tragelaphos, the famous goat stag. Aristotle claims that goat stag means something without being true or false, unless one connect it with being or not being, or simply or in a tensed way. So if I say the goat stag was crashing the goat stag party, then I've got a statement, and that of course will be false because goat stags don't exist. That is, they don't refer. but the point of the example is to show you that you can have a noema which is not necessarily truth functional. So the formulation implies that we can entertain thoughts such as goat stag separately from their being. This too, I take it, is basically a Meinongian point, or Meinongian in spirit, that is, the being of goat stag and the being so of goat stag are to be distinguished, and one is not dependent on the other. Now, words, and I mean with that both names, onamata, and verbs, remata, are phonetic units significant by convention. No part of a word is in itself signifying. This is a twofold departure from the thesis of Cratylus in the Cratylus, as you remember. First, obviously, it's a denial that meaning is somehow natural, and secondly, it's a denial that the meaning of words is compositional, in the sense that the meaning of a word could be the product of the meaning of its parts. Remember such etymologies in the Cratylus as the etymology for phronesis, wisdom, which was reconstructed as thinking, noesis, of motion, phora, and flux, rou. The sounds of wild animals could be significant of their psychic states, Aristotle says, but not by convention. So he's willing to entertain even such things as not man as a kind of indefinite name, but his tendency is to side with conventionally established language and its lexical base. So we have here a full endorsement of meaning being conventional. Now, Aristotle is presumably reporting on grammatical theory of his time when he says that names admit of inflections, ptoses, and that verbs are determined as words which signify by means of time, and that the inflections of verbs and the inflections of names are basically not independent names. That's important for grammatical reasons, but it's not going to be our main concern here. We need to get to the concept of, well, a declarative statement, or a Behauptungssatz, as it's put in German. In chapter 4, Aristotle lays down an important basis for logic and grammar, namely a precise determination of the sentence as that string of words which is capable of truth or falsehood. This is what he calls an apophantikos logos, a declarative or statement-making sentence. Affirmations and negations are types of statement-making sentences. The conditions for being a statement-making sentence are important, as this basically also will determine how a sentence must be structured in order to be truth-functional. In De Interpretatione 5, Aristotle states that a simple statement is one which, I quote, affirms or denies something of something, and that it is significant about whether something does or does not hold. This latter qualification suggests that the simple statement expresses something like an elementary state of affairs or Sachverhalt. The former statement indicates that the basic syntactical structure of a truth-bearing statement features a subject and a predicate. This feature is important for the generation of a statement relation, which is fundamental for Aristotle's logical theory, that of contradiction. In order for one statement A to contradict another statement B, they must affirm and deny the same thing of the same thing, as he writes in De Interpretatione 6, 17a, 34 to 37, not homonymously, that is, not on the basis of an equivocation of some sort. Now, Aristotle spells out the relation of contradiction in De Interpretatione 7, the basis of what the medievals would call the square of opposition. Note that this is introduced in terms of a relation of things. He writes at the beginning, some things are universal, some are particular, others are particular. In addition to this, Aristotle introduces basically the concept of quantification, and that, of course, is a concept that functions at the linguistic level. So he says, it's a relation that governs statements about universals in particulars. He says a universally quantified statement about a universal is, for example, every man is white, and its contrary will be no man is white. Note that's not its contradictory. The negation of the universal quantifier every yields no in this case. Now, as we know from modern property predicate logic, the negation of the universal quantifier simply means not all. So this initial formulation is kind of confusing, but later, luckily, we see that he gets it right and shows us that the negation of the existential quantifier means none. The negation of the universal quantifier simply means not all. So if a universal is featured in a statement which is not qualified universally, one will not generate a contradiction. So man is being taken here as a universal. If we have the two propositions, a man is white and a man is not white, they will be able to be true at the same time. They are compossible, so they will not contradict each other. Universally quantified predications of universals to universals are going to be ill-formed formulae for Aristotle. He deems the statement, every man is every animal, to be ill-formed. Now, I'm grateful to the students in my seminar who pushed on this and said, why is that ill-formed? What's the problem with that? The problem with that seems to be a metaphysical one, in fact, because the idea is that we have a subject and a predicate, and that the subject is the bearer of the property that is expressed in the predicate. And the quantification can only be applied to the subject in this case. The reason for that is because these statements are supposed to reflect the belonging of a property to some subject, so that if you quantified the property, you would be including something that is somehow obtuse to the relation which the statement is meant to express. Back to contradiction in the interpretatione. For a contradiction to obtain, two statements must so relate as for the one to signify universally what the other signifies not universally. For example, no man is white and some man is white are related by contradiction. This means that if you negate a negated existential quantifier, as in the case of no man is white, that can be thought of as a negated existential quantifier, you get the existential quantifier. So Aristotle is thus indirectly expressing, or perhaps relying on, the law of double negation. By contrast, every man is just and no man is just are contrary opposites, because even if they can't both be true, they could both be false, and probably they are. The negation of the one does not entail the affirmation of the other, whereas in the relationship between statements that are true contradictories, if one of them is true, the other must be false. This will hold, Aristotle states, also in the case of particulars. Socrates is white and Socrates is not white will be contradictory statements. There is, however, a difficulty concerning the truth value of statements about particulars which are in the future, the so-called future contingent problem treated in De Interpretatione 9. We're going to confront that difficult problem the next time. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again next week.